Welcome to English 1301.
Are you a student reading Chapter 10 of Light in August by William Faulkner? Or perhaps are you a teacher trying to teach this chapter to your students? Are you having feelings of confusion and frustration as you attempt to navigate through the contents of this chapter? We understand your frustrations and we have been in your shoes before. Luckily for you, you do not have to worry any further. We have specially created a study guide with tips and tricks that will help you understand this chapter and read it or teach it as effectively as possible. Before we get into these tips and tricks, let's start with an overview of the chapter.
This chapter begins with Joe struggling to regain consciousness after being severely beaten. Once he is finally able to regain consciousness, he exits the house and we are giving a speed run of the next 15 years of his life. Joe travels all around the United States and even a little bit into Mexico while having a wide variety of jobs. He hitches rides and looks for work wherever it may be. While traveling, he sleeps with countless prostitutes and tells them he is part black so he doesn't have to pay them. This results in Joe beating a woman nearly to death since she does not care and still insisted that he pay.
At one point, he attempts to settle down and live his life as a black man with a black wife. This lifestyle does not work for Joe, and he eventually finds himself back in Mississippi. He ends up on Joanna Burton's land and decides to sneak in her house at night. He breaks through an open window and steals a plate of food. This chapter ends with Joe finally meeting Joanna. She comes downstairs and lets him know that if it's that is a plate of food that he wants, then he can have it.
One thing that you'll find in chapter 10 of Light in August is that there are many metaphors about race. You will have to watch out for these metaphors in the chapter while you're reading, because they can sometimes be tricky or misleading. You might see words like shine or wop that might seem confusing, but they're referring to race. And again, this setting is in the early 1900s, so you don't get offended by the racial slurs and terms used in the book. It's just because of the time that it was at. Also see metaphors about food in chapter 10. Page 224, Joe Christmas is seen paying $15 for a meal, which was a lot of money in the early 1900s. In chapter 10, you will also see that food and money go along together. Since you've read all the chapters leading up to chapter 10, though, you will see that chapter 6 specifically kind of talks about Joe's problem with food.
The street is a metaphor mentioned often in this chapter. It represents Christmas's unsuccessful search for himself. The street is mentioned as lasting for 15 years, starting from the betrayal from Bobby and possibly ending when he met Joanna Burton. A common phrase in this chapter is, "but the street ran on," which was used to highlight how he's an alcoholic, empty, and unattached to the places he goes. The search is failing. Another thing that goes along with the street is his wandering. He wanders from place to place caused by his unattachment and emptiness. This leads him to traveling all over North America. He travels from Oklahoma and Missouri to Mexico, then to Chicago and Detroit, ending up in Mississippi, where he stays in Jefferson. From the text we know, he could only see himself wandering forever, full of despair. While he travels in hopes his life will change, he accepts this is what his life is.
I have some tips and tricks for the teachers and students. Starting off with tips for the teachers, the first thing is to try to continuously enunciate that during chapter 10, Joe travels a lot. The chapter barely touches on the fact that Christmas's travel was 15 years long. He had no plan to settle down, but rather be a wanderer. Teachers, try to stress all the odd jobs he had. With no plan and endless travel, he ought to search for a way to make money. Another thing for the teachers to notice is that you really should decide to create a visual aid for students. The traveling that occurs in Chapter 10 is very significant and needs to be emphasized enough to explain Joe's impractical travels. He travels in a circle, which can only be seen when drawn out. The teacher could try to create a map and locate Christmas's travels on the map, which would highlight Joe's intention of avoiding settling in one place. For students, I think you should be aware of the fact that we are in Christmas's thoughts. We are in his head. His subconscious thoughts are a big part of this chapter. We are in the mind of him, of Christmas. He thinks things but doesn't say them aloud. We just know that thoughts are personal, yet we are let in on Joe's thoughts. Faulkner does this not throughout the novel to influence us as readers. He imitates our minds with words. Another thing is that Faulkner's writing style is definitely unusual. His constant changing of topics within a chapter and the continuous word repeating was very confusing for me. Here's what I did to assist me with the complex writing style. Breaking down the words and searching up the definitions for each word will help you greatly. Another tip I have to deal with why Faulkner mentions or tells us something, then completely changes the topic, is to put off all curiosity, because it will pick back up. Faulkner is notorious for this, but don't worry, because eventually the topic will come back in later chapters. Lastly, use your glossary as much as you can. The authors of the glossary have read the book multiple times and have broken down everything to simpler words and terms. This can be a wonderful source of help for you. It's easy to access and easy to understand, so use it to your advantage.
The first tip is Faulkner uses metaphors that are often lengthy and confusing. To make them easier to read, you should break them down to see what his message is. Read them piece by piece. Do not try to understand them as a whole at first. Take each phrase of the metaphor one step at a time. The next tip is when Faulkner uses italics in this chapter, it shows that people are speaking in conversation. There is no punctuation in the passage, so read that section slowly as well. Remember that it is two people speaking in a conversation. Another tip that we use is that Faulkner flip-flops between metaphors and reality frequently. Do not let them become one reality. Identify which is which throughout the chapter and keep them separated as best as you can. If you look at his metaphors and reality as a whole, you will likely get confused when reading this chapter. Another tip is what helped us a lot was coming to class prepared with questions. If you are confused with something, write it down, bring it to class, and discuss it with the teacher.